So this presentation is going to be focused on the three colonial regions. This first bit is all going to be about the commonalities, those common features that unite the three colonial regions into one general entity, effectively the 13 British colonies. So let's get right at it. Of course, in class we discussed the geography, the layout of those three colonial regions, and so let's begin here with the New England colonies. Of course, New England colonies begin really at its core with Massachusetts, settled in 1620 by those separatists, and then eventually in 1630 by the plucky Puritans of Massachusetts Bay. New Hampshire is going to break that up into two different halves, upper and lower Massachusetts, and then you're going to round out the rest of this region with Rhode Island and Connecticut. Of course, remember that Vermont is not one of those 13 colonies, but will attain statehood as our 14th state later on. Moving on down the coastline, we come to the middle colonies, beginning in the north with New York, then Pennsylvania, where those Quakers are from, our home state, or in this case, colony of New Jersey, and then, of course, Delaware, slightly further south. To the west of Delaware, we're going to be meeting our first of the southern colonies, which is Maryland. South of Maryland, you have all of Virginia, the largest, the most economically powerful of the colonies in these southern colonies. And then south of Virginia, you have North and South Carolina. And then, of course, Georgia, which serves as that buffer zone, right, between the colonies and the Spanish to the south in Florida. So, overall, when we are talking about these three colonial regions and those 13 colonies that make up those three colonial regions, we are going to be first jumping into those common features. Before we get into any of the nitty gritty regarding the differences, let's really just focus on kind of what brings these colonies together, what unites them, because of course they eventually will become those 13 United States later on. So let's dive in. The common features of the 13 colonies, those three colonial regions, as we discuss in class, really begin with geography. There are really only two common features, geographically speaking, that unite and link all of them together. The first of those two common borders is the Appalachian Mountains. The Appalachian Mountains, of course, spanning the western extent of these colonies, really kind of shaving off the classic modern border into what we see here along this long 2,000-mile long strip. Now, this, of course, is going to be separating the colonies from those untapped lands in the west, but also, too, really from the French territories that are going to be populating this entire region, the Ohio River Valley, the Mississippi River Valley, the Great Lakes, and the St. Lawrence. So this is going to be serving as a natural buffer, a natural boundary between the British colonies here on the east and the French to the west. Also, though, too, as we discussed, the Atlantic Ocean is going to be providing those colonies that really critical access to colonial trade. Sorry about that. Oh boy. Let's pause here and we'll figure that out. As we discussed in class, really all of these colonies are going to be relying on that vital trade access to the Atlantic Ocean. That is why we saw New Hampshire gaining that little strip of land here with its port city of Portsmouth. We discussed Pennsylvania needing its port city of Philadelphia along the Delaware River that separates New Jersey and Pennsylvania, which does give it that key access, boom, into the Atlantic Ocean right here south of New Jersey. So all of this, uniting those colonies geographically speaking. But really, the geography wasn't what united the colonies together as one. Really, it was the Britishness of those 13 colonies. And so we're going to be speaking now to the demographics. So as I say here, of course, despite the regional differences, many of the colonies are going to be sharing common bonds in their similar heritage and language, their religious beliefs, and their social class. So in our notes, we discussed the ethnicities and the religions that really unite all of these people together. So let's start first with the ethnicities. As we said in class, of course, the majority of the people in these colonies are going to be from the British Empire, meaning that they are British. They are people from England, people from Ireland, people from Scotland. So when we were doing, of course, our Atlas activities, we noticed all of those different groups of individuals all hailing from the same general place, bringing with them the same language, right? And of course, too, similar religions. Now, as we also discussed in class, we mentioned how the Anglican Church of England is really going to be reigning supreme in the southern colonies. But of course, those Puritans, those who wanted to purify the Anglican Church, are going to be really dominating here in the north east in New England, right? But of course, Puritanism, Anglicanism, both of these are versions, sects, sects, of the Protestant faith, which is going to be the dominant faith across all of the 13 colonies, across all of the three general colonial regions. And you can see that represented here from our atlas, right, where you had all of these different crosses here representing the different Protestant faiths. You also have some of those here with the Anglican and the Puritan churches as well. The Middle Colonies and Rhode Island, Middle Colonies save New York and Rhode Island, are going to be the only ones that really do not have an official religion, which is why we're going to be seeing groups of Catholics in places like Maryland. But really here we're going to be seeing Judaism having pockets to thrive in cities like Philadelphia, places like New York City, and also too in Rhode Island. Which was that first colony to kind of separate church and state away from the Puritan Massachusetts Bay, highly intolerant colony. So continuing on, away from ethnicities and religions, that as we also discussed in class, what really united all of them too was that social class structure. And so just what I think is a really great way to remember all of this is that the social class structure of the 13 colonies really was in many ways kind of inspired by, or really mirrored, the social class structures that we saw rising up in the Renaissance period, where you had at the very bottom those peasants and the serfs, and above them you had the middle class, which was beginning to emerge, right? Where you had the artisans, the craftspeople, right? And then above them, you would have some of those higher class merchants, right? And then above them, of course, the clergy, the king, high level politicians, lords, etc. So I want you to remember that social class structure from seventh grade Renaissance Europe, and we're going to be kind of adapting it to this new American model. So beginning with that lowest class, the very bottom of that social class pyramid, we really had two general groups. So the first and really the lowest of the social class structure were those enslaved Africans. And as we also discuss in class, the enslaved Africans, their story really begins, of course, in Africa, sold by different African chieftains who were all looking to try to gain more power, more influence within their region by getting access to European trade goods, which would help them dominate their space. They would then trade with those Europeans their captives from their own wars for goods like firearms, alcohol, textiles, manufactured products, as we discuss in class from that triangular trade. But what made this transatlantic slave trade so unique, where hundreds of thousands of Africans were bought and sold into their homelands from their homelands in Africa and then into the colonies, is this kind of evolution of slavery as a unique American model in the form of chattel slavery. And as we also, again, discuss in class, is that this was that legal institution that was this kind of generational enslavement of individuals, where enslaved peoples were owned outright as someone's property, as well as their children and their children's children. And this was really a unique facet of the American model of slavery, kind of never really seen elsewhere in the world, unique to us. So beyond the African enslaved groups of individuals, you also have individuals who voluntarily decided to kind of put themselves into these enslaved-like labor conditions, and those were these indentured servants. We discussed how really historians would believe and do believe that over 50% of the population of individuals who made their way over to the colonies in this colonial age were in the form of indentured servants. These individuals who did not have the financial means to really make their way over here, and so in turn they exchanged a deal of service or they exchanged their service effectively for a period of time of 3 to 7 years, 4 to 7 years, generally ranges, but for their passage over to what would be the United States. This, of course, as we found out, really are going to be taking on a variety of different experiences based on the people that they're working for. But really, what binds these indentured servants together is the fact that they are generally financially desperate. This is why they cannot make their way over on their own. They don't have the money, they don't have the means, they don't have the connections. And so, in turn, they're going to be looking for individuals to help pay their way in exchange for service. So, they're financially desperate, generally single young men, but as we discussed, of course, men and women of varying ages, skill sets will be making the passage. And if you just take the time to read through some of these advertisements up here, you'll see some of those different varied skill sets. The fact that men and women are being asked to come on over. They mention here in this one that is what is wanted as a blacksmith, a young man who is unmarried, right? Is being asked to come on out, right? So it's not just hard work. On the farms, you also see in this one that they're looking for a young man who is skilled in Latin, Greek, and mathematics to serve as a tutor. So it's all different skill sets, all different individuals that they're looking to bring on over. However, because of the simple fact that indentured servitude on the whole was a rough time. We discussed that 40% of the individuals who were indentured would actually live to see the end of their contracts. And this is because of the rampant abuse that was a part of the system. At its core, especially as we discussed in the southern colonies, corporal punishment was often doled out for rule infractions. If curfews were not met, if certain quotas of labor was not met, these people could be punished. These people could be sold to different masters. They could effectively have their contracts reset. And so there are some stories where these indentured servants were never really able to climb out of the end of their contract. Going from master to master with resets on their contracts, many of them would die. The majority of them would die before they saw the end of their contract, effectively meaning that freedom was never gained. But for those who were able to climb out of indentured servitude, this allowed them then to move into the middle class, to rise, to gain that social mobility, to move into the middle class. And so the middle class, again, is now going to be mirroring much of what we saw in the Renaissance, where there are in the middle class now this kind of new emergent artisanal kind of craft person, tradesman kind of role. And so we will be seeing some of those crafts in more of the cities, but at least in the agricultural communities, in the rural areas of the colonies, the majority of the people that live in these zones are really going to be, as we described, these groups of individuals called yeoman farmers. And those yeoman farmers are these farmers who work small family farms. Really, it was all about really working together as a community. If you specifically specialize in certain crops, a neighbor specialized in the raising, the husbandry of certain animals, you would effectively work together, barter together, trade with each other. To ensure that everyone in your community got what they needed in order to kind of eke out a decent living of some form, right? And anything really that was not for subsistence, that was not traded with one another, could be sold at for a profit at market, sometimes in even bigger cities. And again, contrary to popular belief, a lot of times when we think about the agricultural model of the American colonies, a lot of times we think about that kind of aristocratic Southern planter. But this is not the case for the vast majority of people that were in those farming communities. They were these yeoman farmers. Again, small family farms. Some of them might have had enough money to actually purchase indentured servants to bring them on over to serve as workers. Some of them were able to hire day laborers to come on out, and just kind of pay them a daily pay for the work that they were able to do. And also, some of them were able to maybe purchase one or two of their own enslaved people on their plantations. But the vast majority of them, if they did have enslaved people, those numbers were incredibly low. A lot of these individuals were really kind of working on these farms, on their own, with their family members, neighbors, etc. But in the cities, this is where we really begin to see a lot of that specialization take place. In city centers, this is where we're seeing, again, all of those kind of classic needs, those necessities for daily life, kind of for general use, are going to be, we're going to be finding jobs that work to allow those different occupations to thrive. So we see shopkeepers, right, selling daily wares, general wares, printers who are going to be printing books, newspapers, leaflets, pamphlets, etc., to kind of get the word out to the populace. Butchers and bakers who are going to be feeding the people within the area. Of course, masons and carpenters helping to build up new homes, new buildings for businesses, right? As more and more people come on in, we're going to be needing more and more masons and carpenters to house them. Tailors and seamstresses, right, to provide the clothes that these people will be wearing, right? So this is where we see a lot of those specializations begin to kind of rise up, and that's really here in the cities. And again, this is middle class. Uh, what's also different here is in the cities and the urban areas, this is where we're beginning to see some blending of the different gender roles, husbands and wives often working together with their craft, and then they teach those skills unto their children. So they kind of keep this skill alive within their families. They can guarantee, a good life for their children for the next generation. Now, this is really kind of unique again to the cities and the urban areas where we're seeing this mixing of genders, the kind of like a somewhat atypical gender role where women are working right alongside their husbands in the cities and urban centers. It's a little bit more egalitarian in these cities, a little bit more liberal, if you will, where we're seeing those gender roles kind of like off kilter from the commonplace agricultural lifestyle where the men were working in the farms, their boys, their sons would be working alongside them, where the women and their girls would be really kind of more so performing domestic roles, candle making, soap making, tending to the house, etc. Uh, and so this is really the middle class, again, really kind of divided into the agricultural and the urban city centers. But above them were really the dominating class, and that's the colonial elite. Now, the colonial elite, this is going to be kind of getting more towards the merchant class, the aristocracy of Europe. Think Medici, right? The Medici who had really kind of pulled all the purse strings in Florence, right? They really had a huge handle on politics and how just everything worked in Florentine Italy at the time. Um, but here, though, in America, we're seeing kind of some, again, mirror images of this, where the British American reliance on labor forces, indentured servitude, enslaved workers to meet those labor demands in the agricultural South, in the mines, in the port cities, loading cargo onto ships. This is all going to be helping to fuel and really kind of pack the pockets of the gentry class. Those who really were at the very top, who owned the money, who owned the ships, who owned the farms, who owned the power of politics. And the gentry here, as I define it here, the gentry is really this refined class of individuals. They're meant to be sophisticated, aristocratic, whereas I read here, free of the quote rudeness, end quote, of the lower classes, who often had deep connections to those with political power. So this is where we are finding our George Washingtons of the day, our John Hancocks, our Thomas Jeffersons, right? The gentry, the colonial elite, those with power. Now, in the New England and Middle colonies, we see some similar general roles of the colonial elite. Those are really going to be the wealthy merchants who own those ships in the massive trade ports of New York, of Boston, and Philadelphia, and Newport, Rhode Island. We're going to be seeing these individuals who own the ships, that ply those waters to the colonies, that go overseas to trade in Europe. They are going to be the ones that dominate the social class structure in New England, alongside the wealthy farmers with massive plots of land. Those individuals also are really going to be reigning supreme, helping to not only control the economy, but also how politics play out in those areas. And then in the southern colonies, this is where we get to the more classic view of that kind of southern aristocrat in American history, the wealthy planter class. And again, what really separates this planter class from farmers is the planters themselves owned these massive plantations. Plantations, sprawling, hundreds of acres of farmland that are going to be tended by a workforce of indentured servants, of enslaved populations. And again, this is where we are seeing the rise of characters like Washington, Jefferson, right? Wealthy planters who owned 100+ slaves. Washington, who had by the time of his death 300, who are going to be dominating the Southern economy, right? Now, so that is for social classes, enslaved and indentured at the very bottom, the middle classes in the middle, and then you have the colonial elite pretty much at the top. Now, when it comes to the economic features, just simply put, this really what unites all of them is that classic, empire colony relationship. The whole purpose of empires, the whole way in which empires think is they want to expand themselves. They want to grow their influence. They want to grow their wealth, grow their power. And how they do this is through the process of dominating lands and then creating colonies within those pockets to really exploit the landscape, to gather materials, to send those materials back to England, and to grow their wealth, right? So we discussed this process of mercantilism, this economic theory where a country seeks to export more than it imports. Uh, and this whole theory, really as characterized here in this political cartoon, showcases this mother country, in this case, England, or if we want to even say Great Britain, has colonies across the world, in this case, the American colonies, which are designed to generate wealth through the acquisition of raw materials, of foodstuffs, of literal material wealth, gold and silver, which would then be sent back to the mother country. These things being manufactured into finished products, other trade goods that can be then sold overseas or back into the colonies at a profit. And so mercantilism, which is the theory of, or the economic principle of exporting more than a country imports, means effectively that you are going to be spending less than you are making, which means that you are going to be constantly cutting a profit. And that is at its core how empires grow. They want to ensure that they are able to send more out than they are going to be forced to have to bring in from outside their empire, right? So this is mercantilism. At its core, this is how it works. It's all about trying to build up that wealth by using your colonies. But what this then evolves into is this new other kind of unique model of trade, which is called the triangular trade. And so this is what we were diving into in our last day in class. Mercantilism led to the emergence of this process known as the triangular trade. And as it sounds like, the triangular trade is just that. It is a process um, of trade lines that go from one area to another, and then back to the original in this triangular fashion. So, uh, in specifically here, it really begins with that mother country, right? That's the heart of the empire. So the British are going to be exporting goods, right? Thinking of mercantilism, wanting to export less than it imports, or more, sorry, exporting more than it imports. The triangular trade really focuses on this, where it's going to be exporting its manufactured goods, right? Across the globe. In this case, as we see here, and really the first leg here is going to be from Europe to Africa, right? Yes, you can also see here manufactured goods are being sent back to the colonies. That is a part of it. But classically, when we're thinking about this triangular trade, I really want you to think about it in just one simple direction, following this route here, continuing this way, and then going back. So the first leg here, Europe is going to be supplying Africa with finished goods, textiles, iron, alcohol, firearms, and gunpowder. These are going to be supplied to generally different tribal leaders, um, different African kings and the various different African kingdoms, which are going to be used to allow those African kings to gain power within their own kingdoms and to overtake their enemies. Now, in those tribal wars, there are going to be captives. That they're going to be taking into possession, their own prisoners of war, different criminals within their societies, which then will begin that second leg of this journey. In exchange for those finished goods from Europe, the African kings are going to be selling off human cargo, right? And so that is now going to be ushering in this second leg, which historians call the Middle Passage. Middle Passage because it literally is this middle leg of this triangular trade, where slaves are now, as we see here on this map, going to be sent from Africa over to the West Indies and to the American colonies. So captive Africans exchanged for those goods and sold into the Americas. And then rounding it out. And this is the whole purpose of the enslaved transportation, that transatlantic slave trade in the first place, is this third leg. And this is where those enslaved populations are going to be working in these colonies to produce raw goods, right? To harvest cash crops in sugar, in tobacco, eventually later on, really following the cotton gin, harvesting cotton, right? Indigo, rice, right? Even working in the Northeast and in the Middle colonies. Um, these enslaved individuals are going to be really doing the work alongside indentured servants to produce those raw materials, which will be then sent back to England to be manufactured into those products, which would then again be sent back to Africa to just continue the vicious cycle of this triangular trade. Uh, so the economic models of all of this really is, again, what unites all of those colonies. They all rely on the system of triangular trade. They all rely on mercantilism in order to thrive and really to benefit Great Britain, right? Remember, these colonies are not striking out independently yet. Right now, they're all working for the crown, right? They all want to see their empire thrive. So they're all working to feed that mother country, right? This is a video you guys can watch on your own. So let's dive into the last of the common features. And so that is the politics, the governmental systems. Now, when we were doing all of this independently in our own research, you were all focusing on the town hall meetings of New England, the Zanger case of the Middle Colonies, and the really kind of indirect democracy found within the Virginia House of Burgesses and the Southern colonies. Now, while all of those are in and of themselves unique, they all allow different aspects of growth of democratic principles within this country, within the three colonial regions. Um, what is important to remember is that, again, at their core, all of these individuals were British. So they still, at the very top of that political structure, they all looked towards the king, right? Towards the king as their leader. So they were all united under the same governmental principles, under the same general systems. So, as I write here, by 1776, the governments of all the colonies shared some common structural systems, all within the bounds of the English common law, which we described and discussed earlier on, talking about the foundations of democracy, which were established by that Magna Carta. Much earlier on, if you remember, this is where we saw that King John, one of the worst kings in England, right? The guy who died of dysentery, well after he was kind of sacked by his colonial leaders, imprisoned by, not colonial leaders, I apologize, where he was imprisoned by various feudal lords and effectively kind of forced to compromise on relinquishing some of his power to a council of other individuals who wanted some say in society, right? So all of that, right now, 600 or so years later, those individuals, while still subordinate to the king, people still have now a sense of some semblance of say. That's the whole idea of that English common law, that the king himself needs to be bound by law created by man, right, and not by God. So all the colonies also too are going to be still subordinate to the king, but will follow some general principles and will still have some semblance of agency. So the first thing, all of these colonies, what unites them together is that they have a governor, right? This governor, whether he's been appointed by the crown or whether he is kind of effectively elected by people within their charter, and that's something for another conversation, the differences of different styles of colonies, royal colonies, charter colonies, etc. They all, regardless of their type of colony, all of these colonies have a governor. Those governors report directly to the king, and effectively, if the king wants them to do something, they will do his bidding if they must. However, what's also important to remember is that these colonies are still 3,000 miles away from the crown. So there is a general sense of kind of independence that they're kind of all getting used to over the course of their growth. So that governor who reports directly to the king, underneath the governor, he has a council of advisors. Um, if you remember when we were diving into the Virginia House of Burgesses, to the kind of the Mayflower Compact and how the Massachusetts government kind of eventually grew out of that, we discussed how there were these councils underneath the governors who would kind of help to give advice, report back to the people, etc. Within also too the governmental structure, there was a court system, generally again too chosen by the governor, appointed by the king. A lot of it was still tied to the English government. But where we actually saw the aspects of democracy in their society was this, is that all of these governments, these colonial governments, had an assembly, a legislature, a I don't want to say Congress, but kind of like a version of their own little bit of parliament, uh, which was elected by its citizens. So this is where we saw individuals actually having the ability to effect change, whether it was through direct democracy, like in town hall meetings, or more often indirect democracy, where they were able to elect individuals to serve on an assembly to then draft the laws, draft the legislation that would then affect the rest of the populace within that colony. And so this, again, is where we are seeing those common features lie within the governmental systems, the politics that will drive this whole colonial enterprise forward, right? But as time goes on, as we are getting nearer and nearer to 1776, these colonies are becoming more and more independent. As time goes on and that distance remains the same, right? They're beginning to enjoy this level of independence. And when the king later on begins to start cracking down, some of them might want to fight back. But that's for another story. That's for another time. That's for another whole lesson. So, after this discussion of those common features, we're then going to be diving into the unique aspects of each of those different colonial regions, going one by one by one. I'll see you next time.